Okay, welcome everyone. So it's an honor and a pleasure to have Professor Dan Barbezat with us from Amherst College. He's an economist whose teaching is focused on economic history, economic thought, subjective well-being, macroeconomic theory, many things. And for years and years, he's been a very important part of the SUSE program, and the title of his talk is The History of U.S. Economics, but I think you'll all agree it goes much deeper than that and really helps us think in a different way. Really excited to have Professor Barbizat with us, and I'm sure he will engage you as he always does. And thank you, Dan, for being with us. And without further ado, please.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. So I see some of you. I'm on a smaller screen, so I have to sort of pan right or left to see all of you. So, before we begin the sort of ground rules of this kind of talk, please feel free to. You can put something in the chat that Mark will be looking at the chat to see if there's something you comment you want to make or something like that, or you can also just say excuse me or whatever and ask a question. But if you just raise your hand politely, which is a very fine thing to do often, in this context it won't work very well. So please feel free either put something in the chat or actually just speak out loud and say, excuse me, I have a question. So please feel free to do that as we move through. And I'll sort of say hello and take a look at each of you as I can, or at least your little video images, and give you sort of an idea of what I want to do. So rather than think about just the economic history of the United States, thought about like in a very impossible way. Think about like, how did we get here? Like, how did we get here such that the allocation of resources on this planet is something like it is? So like, and if you think about like economics, the kind of standard definition is from a guy named Lionel Robbins, and it's been like that. The idea is like economics studies the allocation of scarce resources, right? But this idea of scarcity, if you think about what scarcity is, scarcity doesn't mean that there's just a little of something, right? It's a little of something over which there is a great deal of want. So economics in its essence is the study of both our wanting and what is produced. So it's naturally a psychological study. So it's always been kind of odd to me that there was a kind of a breakthrough somehow with this idea of like behavioral economics, as if there wasn't a sort of the primary idea was not of human behavior. So economics is really this confluence of our wanting and what is and what's produced. And that, of course, in econo language, demand and supply. It is that interaction. But if you think about it, like, to what end? How do we want to allocate those goods such that we balance that demand and supply? And as the creatures that we are, we haven't really thought about that very well in a global way, right? I mean, we if you think about it, like, we want to allocate, but to what end? Something like well-being, right? Something about but that well-being is the real kicker, right? For individual well-being, for collectives, for social well-being. Like, how do we want to think about that, the way in which that allocation should occur? And that's a pretty important question, given the radically different way people live on this planet and have lived on this planet, and the opportunities that some certain individuals have and take for granted, and others might never in their entire lifetime get access to. So I think it's a really important study. And what I wanted to do today is just give you the most like gross, big view of how those changes have occurred over very long periods of time. Okay, and then think a little bit about like, wow, what determined these kinds of changes along the way, and then what can we say about current growth, modern growth? All right. Now, before I begin, just let me say, there is a lot that I'm not going to talk about because I have an hour with you, basically. I'm talking about a very big topic. So you'd be like, really? You didn't talk about colonialism? Really? You didn't talk about politics? Really? You didn't talk about, really, I didn't. So I'm just going to try to concentrate on one thing, recognizing that this talk is embedded in a much broader, much more complicated actual history of imperialism and warfare and obviously all of that would need to be understood in the context of development. An idea that you could just think about economic models and development, I think has shown to be very harmful to a large group of people all over the planet. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my screen over to a PowerPoint, and when I do that, I will no longer see your very interesting visages, and so I will not be able to respond to any kind of gestures or something like that. So please feel free to interrupt, or if you can't do that somehow, you can send something in the chat. Okay, so let me see if this can work. Screen, give me 1 second. Okay, so start broadcast. Okay, I think yes, good. Okay, okay, all right, so this first image here, okay, is a ridiculous image in one way. Okay, I recognize that. This says basically for the last 3,000 years, this is what income per person has been, as best kind of on average over very, very long periods of time. And this data, as insofar as its data, is put together by somebody named Angus Madison, who looked at economic anthropologists and economic historians, and looked at the idea. If you look at this image here, it is really most data of very long periods of growth. Okay, show that for about 25 for a very, very long period of time, income per capita was relatively stable. This is median levels. That is to say, from someone who has the very least to someone who has the very most, the person right in the middle. There were always people who had, very high levels of income, potentates and kings and so forth. But median levels of income, what we see is for a very, very, very long period of time, median levels of income were relatively stable and relatively equal all over the planet. Now, just let that kind of sink in there for a second. And that is this area here. So this area here. Okay, and this here is this is the year 2000, here it's 0. So it's 1000 BC. So it's like 3,000 years. For 3,000 years there, the income was, it varied. There was variances across the planet. That's true. But the extent of those variations were very, very, very much lower than they are today. And then, of course, something starts to happen. Okay. And here's the kicker. It not only starts to happen, that is to say, and what starts to happen is that per capita incomes start to rise in an unprecedented way, in an unimaginable way. The median levels of incomes start to rise, but, and this is the thing, they rise, but only in certain parts of the world, which means that by the end of this process, the way in which economic distribution is seen on the planet, it's more unequal for median levels of income than in any other time in human history. And you'll see this little line here, this little line going down. That that is actually certain countries, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, that have, since the late 19th century, actually suffered, certain parts of the planet have suffered decreases in per capita income. So when you see this diagram, okay, and again, this is, I'm not saying that this, if this was a limb on a tree, I wouldn't climb very far out on it. That's true. But we do have certain things, certain stylized facts here. Number one, income was relatively constant, not a lot of growth in per capita income. And number two, it was relatively equal. And number three, it's suddenly, and that sudden is really over about 300 years, increased for a great divergence, leaving us at the end of this process with certain places on the planet with incredibly high levels of per capita income, median levels, and other areas with relatively low per capita incomes. Okay, any questions about that so far?
No.
Thank you. Okay, now let's think about that period that's labeled here, the Malthusian trap. Now, Thomas Malthus wrote his famous essay on population, in which he posits how populations determine economic outcomes. And here's a very, very simplified version of this model. Okay, let's take the birth rate and the death rate. Okay, and graph it against Y per capita median income levels. Okay, and we'd see that at very, 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 very low per capita income levels, the birth rate is low, and then prior to industrialized economies, that'll be important. We'll talk about this in a little bit. But prior to industrialized economies, that as the income level rose, so did the birth rate. And likewise, the death rate at very, 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 very low levels of income, the death rate was high, and then it fell. Okay, so here's the birth rate. Here's the death rate, right? Okay, and you'll notice that if you think about population growth, if the birth rate is greater than the death rate, the population is rising, right? The net fertility rate is rising. Questions? Okay. Right? And if the death rate is greater than the birth rate, the population is falling. So where the death rate equals the birth rate, the population is fixed. Okay, so let's think about that level right there. Let's think about the level at which the population level is at a stable amount. And let's have this other graph down here where we have the population size, total population, against median levels of income. Okay, and now let's say that a society can produce only so many goods, and we'll call those goods Y bar. Okay, the total amount of goods and services produced by an economy at a period of time. All right, if the population is very high, right, the amount per person is relatively low, right? And if the population is so that's here. If the population is low for that same amount of stuff, then the income would be high. So we would get a downward sloping line like this at any given level of Y bar, and we call that the technology frontier. Okay, so that Y bar is total goods and services. That frontier is basically just saying for any given kind of distribution, the more people, the less per person. Does it make sense? So if that's the case, if Y bar is given, then you can see that the steady state level of population for that level of income is right here. Okay? That's the basics of the Malthusian model. But check this out. Suppose that there's a Neolithic revolution, okay? And Y bar prime is greater than Y bar, right? What does that mean? It means that for any level of the population, there can be more stuff per person, right? So what does that mean? It means that the technology frontier shifts rightward. Now with a higher level of goods and services. Oh, that seems interesting, right? That means that there's more per person. But can anyone tell me why this will not be a stable equilibrium in terms of population? So that the amount of stuff
because at that
yeah, go ahead.
Because at that level, population will keep growing. They are not balanced within the last situation.
So very, very good. That exactly that at that's why at Y bar, the birth rate exceeds the death rate, and therefore the population rises, yielding a new equilibrium at the same level of per capita income, but at a greater population. And think of the ancient world. Where were the greatest population centers? In the middle of the Arctic somewhere? Where were the great population centers in the ancient world?
Near rivers and big cities.
Exactly. The big cities grew around rivers, like in southern Mexico, right? In southern China, in what we now call the Middle East, right? Those areas developed, they were able to produce more and more agricultural output. And that agricultural output resulted in much higher population densities. So when you look at the ancient world, you see those densities in those areas with the greatest technologies of producing goods. But the amount of stuff per person in those areas wasn't that great. In fact, you probably know, like Jared Diamond has written that, like, actually with, agriculture and, and the way we think of it today, and the development wheat and other grains, the health and well-being of individuals actually decline slightly. So that this Malthusian model is a model of a world in which the per capita incomes are kind of mechanically kept very similar by changes in population levels. And what we see is that in the world prior to industrialization, what you see is a very high densities of population in areas that could produce a lot of goods. Sorry about this. Okay, so if we look at the change in income over time, we get this period, this Malthusian period, wow, right? And then we get this little period here where there's a transition of growth. And then we get modern growth. And what we want to do a little bit right now is think about, like, okay, good. What are so salient in each of these? Like, what we've seen very briefly, we've seen the Malthusian area. Now we're going to talk a little bit about this transition area and fertility in particular. And then we're going to look at this modern growth period and really think, like, what are the main factors, the economic factors in that growth. So when we look at the end of the Malthusian equilibrium, we see that we have this kind of we have this relationship, right? Just like the technology frontier that we built before. And then right at the end of the 17th century, there's this break, and we get this movement this way, which is a movement where real wages are rising with populations. Unprecedented for any long, sustained period of time before that period. And now this diagram, these sets of diagrams are done by a macroeconomist at Brown University, who's thought a lot about growth. And what these are, I don't know if you can see these well enough, but the blue lines are output growth, and the red lines are population growth. And what you see here is that for this transition to modern growth, what you get is a profound decrease in population growth. That does not occur. You can see that that occurs here in the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, here in Western Europe. It does not occur in Africa. It does not occur in Latin America. And what you get is even though output is growing, total output growing is growing mainly because of output growth. Per capita growth is not rising that much. So one of the things we want to think a little bit about is, remember in our Malthusian model, we had a situation where we had income and the birth rate, rising as income rises. Here, we actually have, as income is rising and industrial development occurs, we have fertility decreasing. So if you think about where on the planet today, in a sustained way, not because of some kind of disaster like in Syria or something like that, but rather in a sustained long way, where are some of the lowest fertility rates on the planet?
In the sophisticated countries.
Exactly, exactly like in Denmark, for example, right? Like in France, in areas that have very high per capita incomes and very, as you said, you used the word sophisticated industrial economies. They have very, very low birth rates. Richer countries have lower population rates. Well, why might that be? Well, let's think about that. Let's think about number one. When you think about very sophisticated economies, in that way you just said, do you think that those economies have more incentives and more likelihood that they provide women with economic rights and political rights? Do you think there's a correlation between those two?
Can you repeat the question, please?
My question is think about economies with relatively high per capita incomes and very sophisticated industrial economies. Do we see those economies normally having situations where adult women, have economic and political rights that are akin to anyone else in the economy? Is that more likely the case or less likely the case? As an economy becomes more successful industrial, it becomes more sophisticated in terms of its service economies and production and so forth, does that tend to be correlated with more or less, fewer rights?
I will say that if they have a good education level, that's correlated with less children.
Yes, indeed. Right. So exactly. So basically, you use the word education. Education, when you provide access to education to women, that doesn't mean they necessarily will take it, right? If you provide access of education to women, they'll want to know is, can they use that education in the market? Can they use that education in the economy? And to the extent that they can, they have higher outcomes. But what does that do for the economies? What do you think that does? If you systematically removed slightly over 50% of your labor force, of your potential of discovering new methods of production, health outcomes and so forth, that would be detrimental to an economy. Discrimination against women is detrimental to an economy. It might be used, it might be, beneficial to certain people who perpetrate that harm to those women, maybe, but into the economy as a whole, it is very, it's, forget there's the morality of this, obviously, but it's very costly. What does that mean? It means that when women have when they have full access to education, when they have full access to the benefits of that education in the market, and then they have higher returns, that means that the opportunity costs of having children rise, right? Their careers are affected, their time that they are having children is affected, and therefore the cost to them of having children is higher. And what does that mean? Fewer children. Number two, in sophisticated economies, right? Education is really important. So what does that mean about child rearing costs? What do you think that does to the cost it takes to provide the resources to children to make them successful in the economy?
You may need to spend more money on children education.
Exactly. Think about you guys. Like, look at you. You're in this. We're zooming across. The hemispheres. You're in this program. You're all doing these incredible advanced degrees. Child rearing costs, as the economy becomes more sophisticated, child rearing costs rise. What does that mean? There are fewer children. It's just more expensive. Number three, as the costs of rearing children rise, the cost to having child labor rises, right? So basically, as more resources have to be put into children for them to be successful, other things equal in sophisticated economies, that means that as the economy develops, child labor will decrease, right? That means the benefit to parents of having the child, in terms of now income that the child could make, decreases. What does that mean? Fewer children.
That the benefit of having a child goes down.
I'm sorry?
I said that if that the benefits of having a child
Yes.
goes down and people decide to have less children.
Exactly that. Exactly. And then in terms of those benefits, I'm sorry, I can't say your name because I don't have access to your maybe when you make a comment, please say your name so I can say, great comment, whoever you are. So think about this too. In agrarian economies, right, where you're working each season to make some agricultural product that you harvest, and then next year you make another one. When labor gets older, right, they can't work as much, so they need children for old age security, right? The children, typically in very agrarian economies, children of their parents, or in new families, depending on what the culture is, children take care of their elders. But in modern sophisticated economies, that's no longer the case. There are alternatives. There are substitutes for old age security. I bet Mark there probably has thought about the period in which he will no longer be doing this, and probably has attempted at least to save money, and probably doesn't his long run plan. I might be wrong about this, Mark, but I would be willing to wager that your long run plan is not having your children take care of you in your old age. So what does that mean? It means that another example of the benefit of children decreasing, fewer children. So in modern industrialized economies, we don't have to have paternalistic policies to reduce the fertility rate. All we have to do is provide opportunities, in particular to women. This is incredibly important, right? And allow the economy to function, its markets to function with as little discrimination as possible. And as income rises and the economy becomes more, complicated, more industrialized, and high, and very high levels, highly educated service economies, there will be fewer children. And what will that mean? That will lead to more per capita growth. So in this transitionary period, it's kind of important to have a real transition, a demographic transition, where fertility rates decrease as the industrialized economy, as the economy becomes more industrialized, and as the franchise, as it's called, voting and economic rights are extended because they were denied women for so long. That's an important part of this development process. Okay, so while
I
that's
have a question.
Sure.
Like, this sounds like really rational and like a theory, and how real it is. Like, sometimes it happens that our economic behavior is it's not always rational. So
That's true. That's true.
sentences like people have a substitute for old age social security sounds quite rational, and I'm not sure if all women are thinking about that when deciding if they are going to have a child.
That's true. No, that's very true. I totally agree with you. But here's my question for you, though. Show me like a very like, let's say, advanced economic society where women have lots of economic and political rights with very high fertility rates. Where is one?
Yeah, if we take into account like the examples, you're right. But I think
yeah. You're totally right. The way I'm presenting this, it's like, couples get together and they do a bunch of Lagrangians, they do a bunch of mathematics and decide like, oh yeah, we're going to have 1.62 children. You know what I mean? You're totally right. That's ridiculous. But in thinking about this at 30,000 feet, they act as if this is the case. That like, as these opportunities arise for old age security, and so people do tend to start to, like, if you think about people who think about your classmates, like, and let's look at like in gender terms. Let's think about like individuals who who have the opportunity of either having children or not having children. Their great grandmothers probably had very different opportunities to them. So like your classmates, many of them identify as female. And I would have wagered that many of them do not at like 24, 26 even have some, but a preponderance is probably not to have a lot of children. Whereas, generations ago, by 26, they might have had 4 children. I mean, I totally agree with you that it's a very it's a rational overlay, but it's kind of like trying to put that rational overlay at very large kind of swaths of experience. So it's a great question. It's a great question. So yeah, so again, not suggesting somehow that people are, calculating on the margin what this is, but when you look at the world, this is kind of, it's very simple but powerful explanation. Okay.
Yep.
Now, along with these kind of, this is all kind of rah, econ is, industrialized, it's like, let markets work and everyone's going to be happier. That is not the experience on our planet, right? What occurred, what we can see here in this relative wages diagram, is that certain places, these are relative wages. This is from Robert Allen's Global Economic History, great little book. And these are relative wages computed by a variety of economic historians, 1580 to 1830. This is an estimate of India, okay? And what you see is, like, for a large portion, pretty similar, but then certain areas like England, Netherlands, and so forth, really increasing, which means that what you get is this great divergence across the globe. Now, this great divergence, that is to say, whereas when we look at, in all this area, they're very similar, but by the end of this period, they're wildly different. This has so many elements to it, right? The colonialism of certain areas, the imperialism, there's many factors in this great divergence. But whatever those factors are, I think it behooves us to think, oh my gosh, when we look at the data, let's not think of trying to get at like the answer, but when we look at the data, when we look at like areas that had very high growth and areas that didn't, what can we say about this incredible increase and the difference across them? Okay, so let's think about this, these key factors of modern growth. Any questions before I go on?
I had like a comment to what Thiago said. Maybe the question could be like, not what are women doing that they are not having like this behavior, but what are we as a society are doing that we are not having this behavior. So like maybe if we didn't impose all these maternal or family mandates upon women, maybe we would have like this rational behavior, quote unquote, rational behavior that we are talking about, economic behavior.
Yeah, that is a very, very good question. And your name again, sorry?
Sorry, my name is Galia.
Galia, that is an extremely important point, because the institutions of these societies, whether they be about the nature of what is like maternity or the demands of maternity, or like what like the demands on women in certain kinds of ways, that, or like the identification of gender, as even how that's thought of, all of those are absolutely important. And I think you're going to be more pleased actually with these key factors, because one of the major factors in this differences are these kinds of are these institutions. Indeed, though it's not as if it's falling upon women making good or bad decisions, but the context in which those decisions are being made, and the opportunities that are either provided or denied those individuals. And to the extent that those individuals are constrained or denied those kinds of choices, there are major economic costs to that. So that is a extremely important point. Absolutely. And I so I certainly am not saying that women need to make the right kinds of choices, but rather that the context of that women are in, for example, in terms of fertility, because they are the gender that has children, that those are critical, and the extent to like if there's like gross kind of discrimination against of those individuals, there will be a cost in terms of per capita growth. It will be costly. So that's a very, very, very important point. Any others before I go on?
Yeah, I'm Anna, and I've got a question when the diverged started, because now I understand why it is difficult to move from being one kind of country or the other, or why in the high in the sophisticated countries there are less children. But I don't quite understand why that diversion happened. I mean, why in the countries that, why in some countries that start raising its economy just have a lower population? Why in that moment? Because there wasn't, I don't think, like enough time to in that period to say, well, now we are going to give women the rights, or that the people will know that they have the opportunity to save. And so I don't know if it is real, if it is, if it hosts any relation with the imperialism or colonialism that you were mentioned, but I got that doubt.
Yeah, yeah, it is like that's it. That's an important question too. Like the idea of like, you know, like to what extent, like, you know, what, like the initial conditions of these various economies and the political historical constraints they faced are absolutely important. So to the extent that there was to the extent that there was a colonial power that you know, produced environments in which people couldn't really gain their own advantages, or they couldn't make decisions to you know, get education because of discrimination, you know, against certain kinds of populations that were maybe for example in Latin America, where you were, you know, not of Spanish background or something like that. Those absolutely made big impacts and harmed long run growth for sure. I mean, to the extent that those part of the idea that imperialism and colonialism had such detrimental effects to so many people around the planet is that they didn't provide the kind of opportunities that were commensurate with modern growth and caused very long run you know, implications for those economies that they are still kind of struggling to get out of, because the overhang from those periods still exist. So, I mean, to the extent that those are relevant, which they are, they would fit in this model in the sense of being, you know, gross constraints on the opportunities of those individuals to foster environments where modern growth could, you know, initiate and sustain. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so let's just check this out for a second. Let's do what economists like to do. I had a few figures, now a few equations. Let's have a production function, okay? A happy production function that looks like this. Okay, with alpha between 0 and 1. Okay, basically what this means is like K is for capital. And some of you have seen this before. You must have, right? Efficiency of labor, L labor, and Y output. Okay, so far so good. Okay, so if I take this, so basically this is basically saying that units of capital and units of labor, right, when they combine, they produce more output. And the relationship of those quantities of capital and labor are raised to this exponent, and that it's less than 1 means that there's diminishing marginal returns to that input. That's to say that as I add more and more K, Y is rising, but at a decreasing rate. Okay, and then this E factor here, what's going on here? This E is an efficiency index. So basically it means that, like, over time, as labor becomes more productive, the same number of units of labor produce more output. So think of like E is like 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. So like as I add more labor, as the labor becomes more efficient, as E rises, each labor produces more output. Okay. Now, if I manipulate this a little bit, what I can get is the following. I can get Y, and if you're interested in this, email me and I'm happy to send this to you, but I'm just looking over at the time and I don't have a lot of time left. So I can do a little algebra and get this, okay? For now, you're just gonna have to trust me. Or some of you might be able to just see immediately how this goes. So I can do a little algebra and get from here to here. What does this say? It says that output, and by the way, N is the population. Output per capita is a function of the capital output ratio, K over Y, the amount of labor in the population, so the kind of the population ratio, the work ratio, and E efficiency. Okay, so what has this done? It said, well, in a very short while, can I focus on what elements should produce big changes in output per capita? And the answer is yes. I can focus on 3 factors: the capital output ratio, the labor ratio, and efficiency. Oh boy. So this should be alpha over 1 minus alpha, K over Y, right? So this is K over Y, E, and L over N. All right. This number is some 30 times different in poor, like in poor areas and in rich areas. So there's the richer areas are about 30 times higher per output per capita than in poorer countries. Okay. So if we look at K over Y, E, and L over N, what are the differences? Well, the capital output ratio in very poor countries, like Zaire, for example, is about 4 times higher in richer countries than it is in poorer countries. So K over Y is about 4 times higher. L over N is about the same for very poor countries or very rich countries. So they're very, very similar, right? And that makes sense, right? Because the labor force, the amount of people working in any economy is just about the same. So what does that mean? It means that if Y over N is about 24 to 30 times higher, and K over Y, if alpha is 1/3, that means that K over Y, alpha over 1 minus alpha, is basically Ky to the 1/2, which is the square root, right? Since K over Y is about 4, that means K over Y to the 1/2 is about 2 times higher. L over N is about the same. So what does that mean? It means, my friends, that E is 12 to 15 times higher. Now, that doesn't say a whole hell of a lot, right? But it does say something kind of important. It basically says, look, it's not just the amount of capital you have. It's not whether you work hard per hours, but the productivity and efficiency is radically different in these places. So any study of the differences in output per capita had better come to terms with this E term. Well, what is that? Well, that's a $1 trillion question, right? And this is demography. Yeah, it is demography. Okay, so it is, E is just what your question was before. It's about, it arises from a political, social, economic, historical development. It arises from different kinds of factor endowments, factor prices, institution, schooling, culture. These are the elements that really, really, really matter. And when we're thinking about per capita incomes, what we really have to think about is what can we do to affect that level of E? And by the way, one of the things you're going to have to do is if the United, let me give you one. Oh, this, I think Francisca has it. Do you have your hand up, Francisca?
Yes, I have a question.
Please ask your question.
Because the L above N,
Yes.
it is the same in numbers between wealthy countries and less developed countries, but I have the question that in the tax is included the informal and formal
Great
jobs.
question. That's a great question. Yeah. So if you, I mean, it might be the case that in relatively poor economies, the informal sector is very large, and the amount of labor per population might even be higher. Because the informal sectors are so large, but the informal sectors are so large because of all the difficulties of the formal sector. This is really important. Really important, because if you talk to a very right-wing economist, they'll say the problem is like corruption, or the politics, the Latin American politics. But that's not the case. I mean, that is the case, but to a large extent. But the reason for that is, one of them is like access to markets. Let's think about Latin America. Latin America has comparative advantage in a lot of agricultural products. What does the European Union and the United States do? They protect their agriculture and they subsidize it. Oh my God, what does that mean? It means that if I protect my economy, that means you are going to be able to send fewer goods to me. And if I subsidize my output, that means I'm going to dump output on the rest of the world. What does that do to world prices? Bring them down, right? And then the United States and the European Union has the gall to say that you should produce the good for which you have the comparative advantage. It's like, dude, I would if you would stop protecting and subsidizing your output. So, and when that's done, what does it produce? It produces a shockwave through the developing world, right? Which is what are you going to do? Well, whatever you can, right? Because think about in these developing economies, is it easy to collect taxes, do you think, in most of Latin America? No, it is not. Okay, good. So you can't collect taxes. Okay, good. Do you think it's easy to borrow from the rest of the world? No, it's not easy to borrow from the rest of the world. So what are you going to do? You are going to inflate your economies. I mean, like, duh. I mean, so when we see, for example, currency crises throughout Latin America, it's not, and the kind of like, the response of the rest of the world is like, what's wrong with these economies? It's like, there is nothing wrong, except that they haven't been given access to markets in the world. And therefore, if you are a government and you can't raise taxes and you can't borrow, what are you going to do? How about cutting all social services? What does that look like? That looks like bricks through windows, is what that looks like, which means that what you're going to get is, let me think. It'll take me a moment. I know, you're going to get political instability. Just so duh. You know what I mean? So it's like, what's wrong with Latin American politics? Nothing. It's exactly what you'd predict from an international confluence of what I've just been talking about. So I don't mean to give this lecture like, oh, now we've solved the problem. No, we're in the middle of an inextricable problem. But here's what I'm excited about. I'm a 60-year-old guy yelling at you on Zoom, but you are young, dynamic, and really smart, and you guys are going to solve the problem that we created. So I'm very, very happy about this, because we've screwed things up, pretty bad. But I figure like you are the guys that you're gonna come along and think like, okay, we got this, and you're gonna solve this problem. So I hope I can live long enough to see your solutions to this problem. That's pretty much what I wanted to say today. So I'm happy to take questions. I'm happy to listen to your solutions to these problems, but it's going to be, let me just assure you, it's going to be difficult. So yes.
So this radio, includes the informal job too?
Sorry?
The this ratio includes the informal jobs too, or just the formal jobs?
In the data I gave you, only formal jobs. In the data I gave, but I think that you are right that if we include informal, then I would imagine L over N in poorer countries would even be greater.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm just going to try to. I think Octavio has his hand up. I think. Hello.
Hi, Daniel. How are you?
doing
I
very
would
well,
like
thank
to ask you your opinion on inequality. Of course, poverty is a problem, right? But inequality is a problem itself.
It's a very good question. So this is an ancient question. So let me take it from two different stances. One is I'm being serious now. One is moral and political, right? The question of justice and what is the what are the rights of beings and what are they right to what do they have the rights to? So somebody like Sen and Nussbaum talk about the capabilities of human beings, and that those capabilities, the ability to thrive, the ability to be healthy, the ability to manifest your ideas in the world, those need in a moral and just sense need to be allowed to everyone, right? Then there's the other question, which is kind of like a more technical question. The question around, like, is inequality detrimental? That is a really different kind of question, and that there are very, very different findings on this. You know what I mean? There are some very good books that show that largely unequal economies and societies have much worse outcomes in a variety of metrics, regardless of the morals, regardless of. For myself, I think that this is a very complicated question. Let me just say, a really good question, and like in a very short time, I can only give you a kind of superficial answer, right? But I think I think inequality does matter. I don't think it matters. So I don't think that everything should be made the same. But like how, like the notion that a person arrives on the planet in a context in which they don't have access to clean water, right? And my toilet has clean water, potable water. That there is something profoundly out of whack. Do you know what I mean? So there are ways in which this is not a very good answer, I don't think, somehow, but I would say yes, and we would have to have many more sessions to think about the nature of what we mean by unequal of what, unequal opportunities, unequal beginnings, like there. And I think, but broadly, I would say it does matter. But I don't think I don't think anyone would want a kind of constraint that everyone should have the same, because I don't probably want what you want. Do you know what I mean? But like our ability to like self-actualize, put it that way, thrive, and the capabilities that allow us, and by the way, just to be kind of crazy here for a minute, other beings to thrive. Because like putting human beings first, I mean, it's going to be bad. Like, it's a little bit bad. Like, you hear this from the first world, right? In America, it's like, well, enough about all this human beings. It's like, whoa. We've had, like in the United States, we have so much stuff. Now we're like, let's think about the other animals. I mean, other people on the planet are like, screw you. I mean, like, or the worst is the people here talking about like, oh, income doesn't matter. Income doesn't matter. You can be happy with nothing. It's like, first of all, I hate you. You know what I mean? I really I can't. And by the way, send me your money, you person giving this lecture, because I'll take all of it. That's so, yes, I don't want to swear, Mark, I won't, because it's being recorded, but it makes me want to. Very, very, very upsetting. So that'd be the way I would respond to that. I think Paolo had his hand up first, and then Vincente.
I believe Vicente.
Was he first? Okay, thank you very much.
You can go first if you want.
Didn't mean to put you out of order, Vincente.
It's okay. My question is only to clarify some things because I don't have it really clear. I'm going to say some things and you correct me as I go, please.
I don't think I'll do it, but go ahead. You just
please no. So the conclusion of it is that developed countries are more efficient, right? The efficiency.
If like here's how it's here. I'm going to say it in another way.
Mhm.
When we look, because like we don't know what are or not, but when we look at the data and we try to extract what is the big difference, here's what I'd say. It's not capital per unit of output. It's not the amount of labor hours being worked. It's something else. And we call that something else efficiency. So it's almost like it's what I wouldn't want to say I know what it is, but if I look at capital and I look at labor and I think about the best way I can think about this, it's a whole bunch of other stuff that's not simply the amount of capital and not the labor. Now, one of the things you could call that thing is efficiency, but really it's kind of a mark of like, it's a kind of a big, I don't know, right? I mean, I don't know, but what I don't know is important. It's not just like, I think this is where like other fields make fun of econ, because I think I think economists can be a little arrogant in this moment and say, yes, it's clearly efficiency and productivity. But that sounds good, but it really is, look, Vincente, it's not, if you look at the amount of capital per unit of labor, if you look at the amount of labor being worked, you are not going to get these differences. It is something else. And that something else is what the study of macroeconomic growth is really all about.
So I see that the way I've been thinking about this whole thing as you were speaking.
An old guy like me is happy that you young guys are thinking about it. Good.
So yeah, let's talk about efficiency in the bad way as it sounds. It sounds horrible talking about efficiency when we're talking about human beings, right? But let's take it like that. All right.
Sure.
So if the work is more efficient in developed countries, but there's more labor in underdeveloped countries.
Yes.
And the outcome that developed countries have is bigger too. They have more capital by the end of the day. Wouldn't it be that the capital that the developed countries get is being used to generate more capital in underdeveloped countries that do more labor? But since the labor they're doing is different, let's say, for example, extraction, and the developed countries are doing, let's say, the administration of said labor, would that make sense? Would that be an explanation for it?
I think I see what you're saying. I mean, in the sense that you're saying what I hear you saying. Okay, I might just correct. You correct me if I'm wrong. That is, as I'm hearing, the nature of the labor is quite different in the areas. That well might be, but I think you can see though that like if you think about what you're studying, many of you are studying engineering and all sorts of things that are going to be important for your economy's growth. I don't see any reason why other countries in Latin America, for example, couldn't develop those non-kind of extract. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm vibing with what you're asking, but in terms of but there's no reason that relationship has to be maintained. There's no reason for that. Like we not like you're in terms of like, I think you're right in the terms of like the labor that has been, that is like, you know, in a kind of, in a political order, in a militaristic order, that's been the relationships, but they don't have to maintain. They don't have to be maintained. I mean, I think your generation has the opportunity to really shift quite a bit, because you can produce all sorts of very high valued goods in efficient ways anywhere on the planet. Now, will you have markets for them? Will you be able to, get the capital to be in order to invest in them? That's another kind of question, which is important. But yes, I think you're right in the sense that there has been this kind of, there has been an allocation that's been unfair in that way, that has produced. But here's the thing, that has long run ramifications, very long run ramifications, both culturally, institutions in countries, you know, that had to service those administrations. But I think that I really do believe that can profoundly change.
Yeah. Thank you again. The last thing I wanna say to you. With this that you say, I think about underdeveloped countries doing way too much labor they're not really seeing the real output of that labor.
Yep.
That's going somewhere else. You said it's an issue of distribution. I believe so. I suppose you're familiar with Marshall Salins in economics.
Yes,
yeah,
I am.
Because it makes me very curious, because the distribution is so strange to me. Salins says that in the Stone Age, people could have a much more fulfilled life than nowadays.
Right.
It's so weird to see, but because he sustains in his book, The Stone Age Economics, that along history, labor has been more or less the same until the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
However, not all of people has had an increase in the quality of the life.
Yep, I agree. And have you seen the book, the Dawn of Everything, the new book by Graeber? No. You should check out that book. You'd like.
Oh
this
yeah,
book. Yeah.
I've heard about Graeber, but I haven't.
You would like this, but this book is built for you.
Okay, how's it called?
I think is it called The Dawn of Everything or something like that? I don't have my. If you email me after I'll my email is just, you can find it at Amherst College, but it's dp.barbezat@Amherst.
Okay.
Email. And but now we're almost out of time, but Paulo has been very,
Paulo.
very patient.
I'm sorry, Paulo.
No. The Dawn of Everything. There it is. Yeah.
No problem. Daniel, how should Schumpeter innovation theory contributes to explain increase of work efficiency? Because Schumpeter adds in a paper of innovation in economic growth, and if we look, the only way to increase productivity, efficiency of work or labor is adding technology or adding value or changing scope of the work. And how that kind of theory or different theories helps explain economic change of increase of efficiency.
Yeah, good. That's a great question, and a huge question. And like that seems, talk about fairness. It seems unfair to drop that question with a minute left in my talk. But so that's a great question. And let me say that like that kind of Schumpeterian model matters a lot. Okay, but Schumpeter also was someone who really thought that you could, like Gerschenkron and others, that you could sort of hop over levels of development. So in other words, like just because people went from, from like pre-agricultural, agricultural, industrial, and then technology, you could go from agriculture to technology. You can jump over those. You think you might say, no, you can't. Well, a country like South Korea is a really great example of an economy. If you think about the North and South Korea, 1950, where was the richest part of Korea at the time? All in North Korea, all industrialized. South Korea was agricultural, right? And right now, the per capita income in South Korea is orders of magnitude higher than best estimated in North Korea. It's not even clear. So those are very important. However, there have to be access to markets. There has to be the political opportunity and for those markets to sort of reach fruition. And in an economy that seems to me to exhibit such a kind of, in my opinion, a kind of racism that those theories will not engender change because of the endemic and structural racist kind of ways in which these international markets are constructed. And I hate to end it on that kind of, but let me say again, and I do really wish you all the very, very best. And it's very exciting to see your faces and read your bios. And I look forward to you guys, again, solving these issues.
Thank you, Dan. That's amazing. And I did put your email in the chat in case people want to follow up with you. And thank you for
Please do.
inviting them to.
Sure, please do.
And that was fascinating. Obviously, a lot of provocative questions that deserve a lot more time. God willing, when the group actually comes here sometime in the near future, we can invite you again to
I'd be happy
highlight
to.
what you talked about. But thanks
That'd
so
be fun.
much.
You're very welcome. Be very well, everyone.
Okay.